you.
Bonjour, Dominican. So hello, our relatives. Makwanindodem and Makanakangandamjaba. I'm Dr. Freeland, Indigenous. So Makwanindodem. So Bear is my clan. And so in this period, I'll give some like these fuller introductions, if you will, and they're not meant to be self-aggrandizing in any sense, but just kind of engage in Indigenous protocol about who you're related to and negotiating what those things mean. And when we're speaking cross-culturally, sometimes that helps to fill in some of the gaps in particular. So being associated with bears and being related to bears in that way, in this kind of large extended family, and ways in which in my Anishinaabe culture that's associated, bears in many cultures, Indigenous cultures, are associated with medicine. And that is not to say that I'm somehow a medicine person, much to the contrary, but the ways in which we engage in what we're supposed to be doing is associated largely with medicine. And there's a lot of ways that can function, and I would like to think that I kind of engage that from an academic / educational perspective, and I think in education is medicine. So I'm from Bahoting, Anishinaabe Aking, so a traditional indigenous land in northern Michigan is where my family's from. My great-grandmother is originally from the Mackinac, what is now St. Ignace, Michigan. And Mackinac relates to the turtle's back and the ways in which that goes to our origin narratives of Gijigokwe, a sky woman falling from the sky. And falling into a world filled with water that was already in existence, and then co-molding the land and reshaping the land on a turtle's back. And it is that area that we come from. So, you know, I've had unfortunately a lot of opportunity to use several lines, which is, this is not our first rodeo with a pandemic. As Indigenous people. And, you know, I can kind of say that tongue in cheek in kind of a humorous way, even though obviously the situation is dead serious. Unfortunately, an emphasis sometimes on the dead, and because there's the reality of that as a particular negotiation. If we know, I'm sure we all at least have some sort of contact with people who had it. Sometimes it's, it drops people for a loop, and other times it's kind of light and you never really know. So trying to negotiate our way through this is something to pay attention to. And there's a lot of things to pay attention to right now in our reactions. And it is a very, very interesting time about where values lie in this discussion. So what I'd like to share with you today is kind of a longer negotiation with pandemics in particular, demonstrating both kind of this long-standing engagement and memory, but also the agency, Indigenous agency around it to shape our own narratives, as well as just power to resist in those certain ways. So there's several kind of across time with memory that we can think through, and others in a very contemporary setting, dealing with COVID particularly. So there's a lot at stake, and what we know, particularly across time, is these pandemics have been devastating, particularly when your knowledge base is held in people. When your knowledge base is held in oral tradition, when it's held in elders, we know that elders are more susceptible to some of these diseases. And when they come through in full force, there's a lot of loss. And COVID is no different. And particularly, and I'll talk a little bit later on about language revitalization work that we do, and the risk to Indigenous communities right now. In this process of cultural and linguistic revitalization, we're at some very difficult periods. And while there's certainly some positives happening in a number of different communities, when these things sweep through, it's taking our elders right now. And that's just kind of our reality. Um, so I really just kind of want to share some of this knowledge to help make sense of some of the present. You know, we all have to draw upon our own knowledge bases about what this looks like. So I have a couple of different brief arcs to talk about some kind of poignant moments. We know, of course, with the Colombian landfall, there was what was probably a swine flu spread in the Caribbean, which laid waste to huge numbers of people. Probably the best demographic evidence coming out of Hispaniola, particularly, was between 1493 and 1500, while Columbus was in charge. About 7.5 million Taino people were killed in that short period of time, largely by disease, but also through the violent, the cycle of violence that included not only disease, but these cycles of destruction, cultural destruction, and lack of access to good food and medicine, and just being chased and threatened and punished and killed all the time. It is those things together that create the genocide. We cannot give an apology to say that, oh no, it was just the pandemic, right? That wasn't the reality on the situation. But as far as the American mainland, we know that 1518 to 1522, smallpox came through up out of Mexico, spread by Cortez. And this pandemic had a significant chilling effect on the entire continent. And while I think that the overarching numbers, some demographers suggest 90% were killed in these waves, I think that was an overemphasis. I don't think that many people were killed outright. When you still have access to good food, to your own medical systems, when you're not stressed out and being chased all the time, even in the face of pretty difficult diseases like smallpox, people can and still do survive. And we know that the smallpox went all up and down all of North America, because several decades later, when De Soto and others were kind of coming through what is now the Southeast, there was evidence that they came through with communities who had still the pox scars on their faces, decades later, demonstrating that they survived and still had large populations of people. So we know that there was not necessarily that sort of full out 90% reduction, but probably 10 to 20%, which is still devastating. And that is important to pay attention to. But this kind of puts us on notice, right? We know that some of these engagements are happening, and we knew the communication that was going up and down places like the Mississippi River. So, I mean, if you think about this sort of thoroughfare in North America from the Gulf Coast, which is not that far around, to what would be, you know, kind of Teotihuacan and, you know, the Yucatan Peninsula had substantive cities. The thoroughfare of trade that went up the Mississippi all the way up to past where I am, you know, essentially to Minneapolis. We know that this sort of communication patterns happen in what we call the protohistoric period, so that the diseases were out ahead of the actual contact. So, and there's this lag in this jump that is important to pay attention to, where we acknowledge that something was shifting and changing before there was actual contact, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. We also know 1763 that smallpox was not only inadvertently spread, but also used as a military weapon. So with Jeffrey Amherst in 1763, we know the letters between him and his lieutenant at Fort Pitt, who just said, you know, flat out, take some blankets and handkerchiefs from the smallpox ward and give it to the Indians and try to take care of the problem that way. And that was during Pontiac's rebellion. So my relatives, Odawa people, Pontiac was Odawa, and they were a significant resistance movement against encroachment from the British at that time. And we know that killed well over 100,000. So there's a significant wave of these things over and over again. So it wasn't just that there was a pandemic and smallpox came through and then it was done. Every couple generations, every 50 years, these diseases were coming through. So influenza, then mumps, then measles, then smallpox again, and it just kept cycling through, and each time taking huge numbers of people. Later again, also in 1837, up the Missouri, up kind of where I'm at now, up the Missouri River was also a major thoroughfare in early trade. So there's evidence of, in 1837, a smallpox being intentionally spread by the fur companies to reduce competition among the Mandan folks there. So we know that a low-level trader met with high-ranking fur trade company people, which just didn't happen. There was no reason for that meeting to happen. We know that the meeting happened, and we know that there is evidence of newspaper articles of this person bragging about it, essentially that he was going up the river to spread smallpox to the Indians. And another one, upwards of 100,000 killed in the Mandans there in 1837. So right prior to this, fuller run. So if we think about the time frame, right? So 1837, then we get to 1849, then we get this 12 years prior with this pandemic going through, which wreaks havoc on the area, and then all sorts of people start running across the land out to California. Then they stop off in Colorado in 1859. That these things they come in close succession to one another, and that is just this. We're starting to get this direct contact, right, and really being disruptive at that point in multiple different ways. But those are coming up some of the early pieces, and this is just to demonstrate that we know where these things were coming from. That we know that there was multiple cycles of disease that came through over and over again, and that many of our early, how should I say, the medicine structures, both botanical and ceremonial, had little effect on some of these. So when it came through, there's a lot of difficulty. But that does not suggest there wasn't resistance through this period. Even though the smallpox largely upended Pontiac's rebellion, we know there was little resistance post 1837 to encroachment of the fur trade. There were still other levels of resistance. So when we think about into the 20th century now, and anyone's interested, Dr. Brenda Child at the University of Minnesota has written about this more extensively, which this is kind of newer historical information coming out through a deeper engagement in this process of relating to pandemics and difficulty. But so in Anishinaabe culture, we are originators of what's called a jingle dress dance. And this jingle dress dance has a particular narrative that comes with it. So what we were told is that a gentleman, his daughter was really sick, and he kept having this dream, and he kept dreaming over and over, and it was, and the dream is the same thing each time, is 4 women dressed in 4 different colors with these little kind of trinkets or something sewed onto their dresses that made a sound, and they danced in a certain way. And you kept having this. And within Indigenous culture, of course, there's not a distinction between real and not real. There's not a distinction between dream world and non-dream world. Those are all important experiences. So that was demonstrative of that he was supposed to do something for the community. So his wife made the outfits, he made the regalia for dresses, and he showed them how to dance and what the dance was supposed to be like. So they bring this out at was probably a big drum ceremony. So a big drum ceremony is not just, there's kind of a social gathering part of it, but the Big Drum Society is the Medicinal Society, in which the drumming and the singing, usually done at night over, sometimes much of the night, can provide healing in a number of different ways. I know other different kind of aspects to it, but generally speaking, that the drum is kind of the center. So during one of these ceremonies, this little girl is laying there, and she's not responding to any other treatments. And the he tells the narrative of this, and they start to dancing, and so they dancing a few other times around, and when these women are dancing with these new dresses on, that this little girl kind of perks up. She kind of lifts her head, and through successive songs and singing, that she kind of goes from listening to sitting up with the people, and then within a little while she's dancing with the women, and that there's this curative properties that was happening with the jingle dress dance, and that is used in a number of different periods. So what's really interesting in looking through this kind of both culturally and through an academic study is that we can place this very specifically, both in time and space, and that this was not necessarily some sort of long-standing tradition. We know that this comes probably post-World War I, excuse me, that we know right around that 1918, 1920, in response to the Spanish flu pandemic, that pandemic, they created quite a few soldiers that were in World War I that came back, and then unfortunately had infected quite a few people during that pandemic. And in response to that is when this dance comes in. So we know that it is a relatively recent one, though in Indigenous communities, like we're not putting dates on stuff, right? That's a very non-Indigenous negotiation in this linear trajectory of time. But we know what it was associated with. And so it was associated with this other disease, and is most likely at this period. And even though there was quite a few pictures of Anishinaabe regalia and other places in northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and such, this dress didn't appear in any photos until about 1920. So we see that this sort of agency, this dynamic shift and change happens in multiple ways. So we see this kind of curative property come up through this ceremonial dancing that it comes through. And of course, now the jingle dress dance is a pretty common thing. It kind of hit the powwow circuits. And while it is certainly given a nod in the same sort of medicinal quality, and I'm sure a lot of people want to do that, though what happens at a powwow is not necessarily the same as a big drum ceremony. And the regalia has shifted quite a bit, and then we get these kind of different protocols. So it's interesting, Saturday, my daughter, it was her first jingle dress dance. So she is 6. And my wife, Dr. Charity Bassett, who also went to ILIF as well, made her a jingle dress. So she danced the first time this last Saturday with folks. And it's pretty powerful to watch different people do this sort of dance and knowing particularly what it's grounded in and what it is being used for. So she's learning this sort of medicinal quality and what it is that we can do. And of course, it's not magic in the sense of like you put on a dress and you do a dance and automatically people are taken care of. Like there's much more to it than that. But that is, it's a useful narrative to think about the agency of Indigenous communities in response to these sort of pandemics, because usually it is, the narrative, of course, is like, well, pandemics came and wiped everybody out, and then that's pretty much the end of the story. But when we think about what Indigenous people were doing, not that dissimilar to ghost dance that was coming up, prior to that in the 1890s, kind of sweeping through the West here as people are dancing, trying to make their situations better, and a lot of that information is given is largely Euroformed. It's like, well, they thought they were going to dance and bring the old world back. It's like, no, that's not really an accurate depiction of what they were trying to do. They were trying to dance to make their situation better. They weren't, going back in time. That's kind of a very, very much a way of Euroforming the idea of linear time frames. But this tradition of dancing as this kind of curative and ceremonial properties has a long negotiation as we go through this. So if we move again forward here, if we can talk about COVID kind of particularly, when we think about what this agency is, so I'm not sure exactly what people have engaged or not engaged, so I can just kind of give the longer narrative. So when this hits, again, this is not our first rodeo. We know what's going on. So pretty early, much earlier than many other places, states, counties, municipalities, Indigenous communities were already hunkering down and setting forth plans because we know what to do, right? In some ways, like areas where I'm at in South Dakota are already pretty isolated and rural, which is actually a benefit in a lot of different ways at that point, right? So in South Dakota, two Lakota communities had the resources to do some pretty significant shutdowns. So they literally blocked the roads coming into the reservation. So both Cheyenne River and Pine Ridge had enough resources to shut down these main thoroughfares coming through the res, which really is, are you passing through? Okay, you can go through, but you were going to hit this other checkpoint by such and such time. Or you're coming on the res, who do you know? Why are you needing to be here? And many people were being turned away. And that became kind of a big how do you do? And so unfortunately, non-Indigenous people will often kind of think about like, well, my rights, how is this affected? But if we think about social relationships and what this actually means, we can come to a much different understanding of why this is necessary. So if we take, for instance, Cheyenne River, they've got 2 ventilators on the reservation. And really not much, I mean, there's a healthcare facility, but not much of anything significant. And if people need intensive care, they got to go 5 hours away. And really just not having the local resources to actually deal with the pandemic. We know what the situation is coming down, that people are running out of respirators. So if you don't have them, your best course of action is to shut down every border possible and don't let anybody in, right? And that is certainly a question of sovereignty when we think thoroughly about what it is. If this is truly their land and something to do with, that becomes a pretty big issue. This, of course, gets some play through state and federal, both media and political contacts, with our local governor really calling into question whether or not they can shut down the state highways. Well, if it's state highway, that's fine that you're taking care of it, but it's crossing Indigenous land. Fundamentally, they were able to keep the roadblocks in place in some way, shape, or form. And while there was some loosening through the summer, of course, as many places were, they're still able to effectively mitigate some of these responses. Now, that doesn't mean it's completely shut down in different areas. Pine Ridge has gone through about 4 or 5 shelter in places for a varying, a couple of days to a few weeks. And this is significant. And what it means, particularly in a community, for particularly many youth who only eat even remotely good at school. And then when you have to shut down the schools, the sort of ripple effect that causes coming out into the community. And the significant stressors that are put forth, like what has been happening, is everything's just compounded. And you have to do the shutdowns or else you're going to spread the disease and kill a lot of people. And like I said, what it means to keep knowledge holders and particularly language holders, first language speakers alive, we're at a pretty significant juncture with people. So at our school, we are working diligently in language revitalization. So this year we've finally rehired somebody to teach Lakota for us. We had to do it via a DDN. It's kind of an electronic platform at a different school, which we know is about the most awful way to learn language, is through these other kind of, the class is somewhere else and we're going to learn it at a distance. That's just not how language is done. So we're in the process of negotiating that. But in the last couple of years, we've made significant contacts and are working with some local groups, St. Francis Indian School on a Rosebud, to help them work through language revitalization. And through this process, you know, we get to not only know people, but some deeper information. The truth is we just don't know, we don't have accurate data on how many first language speakers there are left. The last count we knew was about 5 years ago in the Rosebud, and there was like 600 left. And Standing Rock was a similar time, where it was like 3 years ago, and they had like less than 350. Pine Ridge has a few more, but almost all of our first language speakers are above the age of 60 and at significant risk to all of this. So when we think about this and we see things like roadblocks, we have to take in this much larger sociocultural context about what is actually at risk, right? It's bad enough that, you know, we got people at risk of getting COVID and potentially dying. And what does that mean if the people are at most risk are the knowledge holders, are some of the folks who have the language skills that we need desperately right now to keep passing these things on? Like I said, we have some positive engagements happening and people diligently working on it, but you don't revitalize and make a healthy language in a couple of years, right? This is a generation or two that we need to really replenish our language speakers. So when we think about these sort of reactions, I think a lot of folks saw that as like radical or really life-changing. And when you can really sit down with people and let them know what's really at stake here, it's not just the loss of life, but loss of cultural context and language that is really, really valuable right now that we work on. So I really think that these are the pieces that we have to think through, and we're thinking about kind of this Indigenous response, which is really at the forefront of what it is that we're trying to do right now. So we actually just signed an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with St. Francis to help them develop language curriculum through it. And so there's interesting reality around Indigenous language. There's still a number of people who can speak and are trying to teach it, but I mean, just like any sort of foreign language teaching, like I can speak English just fine, but I can't teach it to save my life. Like I'm not qualified to actually teach it to anybody, right? And the same thing is true for any language, that there are particular pedagogical methods that are effective in one situation and not others. That we use for second language acquisition. And our modern language program here and most other places that, you know, function within world language standards use those methodologies. And that has shifted pretty significantly in the last 15 to 20 years, whereas a lot of the Indigenous languages have not caught up to that, just because people aren't going through educational systems where they're learning how to teach foreign languages or second language acquisition. So there's a lot going on there. So the reality with COVID is the danger scale for our communities is certainly raised quite a bit. So that's kind of the short version. I would love to engage with folks, even though we're not in the same spot. And I know it can be a little bit weird on Zoom. And I say that not pejoratively, but just as an educator who is forced to teach on Zoom a lot right now, that the engagement isn't quite the same. So whatever folks are comfortable with, if you've got questions you want to put in chat, I'd love to see your face and hear you speak as much as possible. And I know I've tried to save a decent amount of time for that sort of engagement to really hear where people are at and what sort of questions they might have.
Thank you so much. As Dr. Freeland invited you to and have engaging time with the questions and discussions, please feel free to do so. You know, so what we heard was not only historical overview, which our public high school or public education doesn't teach, but also, you know, when we think about COVID and pandemic, we only think about infection, but here we hear that culture and history and that the takers of that language and everything is at risk. So which is much larger than what we think about a pandemic as just a disease.
Mhm.
So any questions for Dr. Freeland?
Thank you, Dr. Freeland. You talked some about kind of what the cultural resistance was to, I mean, particularly the willful spreading of pandemics. Is there any, given that we're a theological school, was there any kind of religious or cultural impulse from the settlers in that process?
You know, that's a good question, Jeremy.
Like, was this kind of part of the bigger picture of Manifest Destiny, and this is the shining city on the hill kind of story?
Yeah. So it really, you know, colonization is just a chaotic mess, you know, and like, while the you know, the socio, how should I say this? The easy answer would be to say, no, everyone is in on it, you know, and I think that generally speaking, that was the case. So if we think about the role of, I mean, if you think about 1763 in Fort Pitt,
Mhm.
in that particular time and place, we know that there was a lot of communication, and part of the rebellion that Pontiac was leading was that the local people that weren't necessarily associated, that were squatting, you know, over this particular over the Appalachians, essentially, which was kind of the dividing line treaty-wise. And people who are out ahead of that were like literally just randomly killing Indian folks. And so I would, you know, suggest in like that sort of place, there was the spreading of smallpox would have been like, finally, we're getting rid of these folks, right? Now, if we think about, you know, add the religious kind of component to it, there's an interesting mix. So if we think about like early missionary influence, we know that several of them were inadvertently spreading diseases. So there was, I want to say it was John Heckwelder, in kind of the New York, Ontario area when he was coming through, and you know, the kind of thing about he's coughing his way across the landscape and you know, infecting people with disease. And there was, in some communities, it was certainly understood that we want to resist that sort of missionization because of both that's something foreign and detestable, and because of the disease, right? So it depends on the local engagement, how strong the resistance and cultural socio-political structures that stay in place, as long as there's still that kind of indigenous engagement where they, as long as you can rely on yourselves and there wasn't too much shifting, that there was still resistance. It's not really until the late 1800s that in most places, even as far east as New York, that local indigenous communities are really being susceptible to missionization in large scale. I think certainly some of the missionaries also were early speakers against certain forms of colonization. You know, we know Samuel Worcester is Baptist, right? So he was, you know, ends up in a Supreme Court law, Worcester v. Georgia, in which he sues the state of Georgia about their laws that just said, oh, by the way, you're in the state of Georgia now, Cherokee folks, and you got to go, you know. And we know that they won theoretically, and then Andrew Jackson says, well, John Marshall's made his decision, let's see him enforce it. So then, you know, the next 2 years later, we get the Removal Act. So then they congressionally kind of push it through. So particularly around disease, there's not a lot engaged upon. So once we kind of get to that point where missionaries are thoroughly engaged or have local communities in which they are negotiating, which is usually not a main community. They're off to the side. They kind of start their own Christianized version. Once that starts happening more specifically, there's not a lot of resistance to them for the local community, but there is for others, and that part's not written in the same way. All right, we know that there's resistance, but it's not part of a missionary's discussion in his own notes, is by and large what we get. And they're largely focused on, in particular, on language. Bishop Barriga in in northern Michigan, we know that he works through and gets a lot of, he's literally transforming our language at that time to invent words and do stuff like that. So I'm gonna get through there. Hey, buddy. Sorry. Want a drink?
Mr. Pooh.
He's going to come back. You lock me in? Thank you. So, I mean, I think that it's a very, very interesting question, because we really have to get into the nitty-gritty of local places and what those voices are saying and doing in particular situations.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Other questions? Dash?
Yeah, I have a question related to the language learning process you were describing. I guess I'm wondering how much collaboration is happening between different tribes, between different language groups to try to save these languages. Because I know I have separately heard of initiatives a little bit from you, some initiatives that are happening in Hawaii, and I guess I just don't know how much of whether there's any coordinated effort to maintain languages as opposed to a series of individual language group efforts.
So there's not a coordinated effort, as in there's like this large either hierarchical or bureaucratic structure that is all working on the same thing. It is localized, and without a localized leadership force, these efforts, particularly in indigenous communities, often fall flat. So it really waits upon people who are going to kind of take that leadership. Now, I would use the term, there's a lot of collaboration among different groups of folks who are working together on knowledge. So particularly in Hawaii and New Zealand have been at the forefront of this. So they're several decades ahead of us. And so a lot of folks that have come through, the first thing like, oh yeah, I was able to go through and see the language nest in Hawaii or New Zealand. And so that their core work into negotiating immersion language schools has been at the forefront, and that's been a really, really positive thing. Now, the question is out here, since there's been so much language loss, having qualified teachers to then teach in the own indigenous language is really, really hard to do. And one of the things that we're working on right now out here is the development of these things. And usually you kind of start with preschool, and then the next year you get preschool and kindergarten, then preschool, kindergarten first, then you add one layer each time, because you just don't have the resources to throw at everything and develop that sort of curriculum. And there's kind of a range of full immersion where somewhere like the Akwesasne Freedom School in Northern New York, or some kind of hybrid versions. And it depends on the community and what they actually want to accomplish and what your goals are, you know. And there's ups and downs each way. So while there's not, like I said, this large scale, we're all on the same page approach, there's not an overarching negotiation. There's a lot of collaboration, and there's a lot of localized places where you got people doing really good work. But it is just a long-term process. And it is one that needs constant work. So for example, in northern Wisconsin, I can't remember the name of the school right now, but there's a full language immersion school in a reservation in northern Wisconsin. And that was really the brainchild of somebody who left the reservation, went all through school, got a PhD in linguistics, and came back for the express intent of developing an immersion school. And that they had local support and did some good grant writing. And that's, they got it through. So kindergarten, then kindergarten first, and kindergarten first, second. And eventually they're K through 8 right now. But even with that, if you don't have a community resource of people out in the community to communicate with them after school, and then when they get into high school, things are shifting. So like Akwesasne is the same thing. You got K through 8. And the sociocultural difficulty that a number of students have to deal with, being in an Akwesasne Freedom School where they are like loved, like educationally they are supported in such huge ways. All of a sudden they go into a high school, is a stark contrast. So, we're in process of working through a number of those situations. And, like I said, what we can offer at South Dakota State is access to language methodologies, which when put into play can provide that sort of methodology to keep those larger community aspects associated as well, so that it can be communication in the community all the time. Because school is pretty easily compartmentalized, particularly because it's literally in a different place. It's in a different building. And think about the particularities of the environmental structure is really, really important in education. And that's, my family's, we're trying to homeschool with our kids now because we don't want them out and about in the school system right now. And just the environment of them being at home is not the same as being at school. Like, I know kids just do better. I mean, that's just a reality because they walk into a school building and here's the expectations. And just because of the semiotics of it, it just functions that way. So, working through all these things is fascinating, and it's really, really engaging. So we're really happy to be able to do that.
Great, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
I have a quick question, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
I was really interested to hear about your story about the weaponization of the viruses in the past, which I had not really thought about before.
Mm-hmm.
But we're starting to see, hear rumor that, certain communities now might be targeted in certain ways as well for various reasons. And I was just curious, in a nutshell, what do we do differently as a society or as an individual or as an institution in a community to try and ease the threat of political mandates or policies through local governments to try and put a handle on this virus that seemed to be sparking so many problems in our nation right now? I'm just curious, from your perspective, had, let's say, the smallpox pandemic been happening in today's world, what would you think a retaliatory, politically correct, whatever you want to call it, response be to people who have nefarious means or attitudes towards controlling the virus as we move forward? Does that make any sense?
I think so. I will certainly give an attempt, and if you want to re-ask a question or ask follow-up, I'm happy to do that.
Sure.
I think at a base level, I would suggest that what we're struggling with is a couple of different things. At a base level, I just don't think many people have a real grasp on viral transmission in science. Just basic understandings of how this actually functions. To know that there's these pictures of these little tiny proteins and that they might be in a droplet or an aerosol, and what those concepts actually mean, or even what actually is quarantine literally versus isolation. You know what I'm saying? Like, because we haven't had this sort of thing, we're coming up against just some kind of gross privilege and never having to deal with any of this. So at one level, there is a certain sense of just ignorance of basic science and disease transmission, and closely associated with that, then we could also think to say how there's some real statements being made about value of life and how is life actually valued. And I know that this is, again, because as a larger society, we haven't dealt with this really since the 1920 Spanish flu, having to actually put this on the board. Local communities had. I mean, I think we can talk about LGBTQ folks in the 80s with AIDS. I mean, they certainly had to have an understanding of what was going on, and then this larger structure being like, yeah, we don't got to deal with it, or senators getting on the floor of Congress and being like, well, if they stopped their behavior, then they wouldn't do it. So there's this really, really nefarious pieces, and I think that would be an example, one of the few examples in a more contemporary status of this engagement. I think obviously because of it's an election year, these sort of differences are amplified in ways which are wildly unhelpful. And rather than just being able to focus on what is the better way of negotiating this and how do we get people done, through this, right? So we know that there are these arcs, that we can have an arc that is beyond COVID or what's going to happen. This isn't our forever, it's our right now. What do we actually do economically? And those are like real questions. But this kind of goes to the value question about what are we valuing and how do we value life? And what are the mechanisms, institutional, that provide those sort of resources? I mean, fundamentally, we're utterly dependent upon this larger capitalistic system to get our basic needs met. I mean, that's just a reality. And if a bazillion people go unemployed and can't do that, I mean, we still don't know where this is going to head eviction-wise and all of that. So there's some real questions about how to do that. I mean, if we think about, if the question is more sorted, like, are there ways in which communities that could be weaponized or thought of as, I mean, I guess sure, but I don't, even in Indigenous communities, there's not a large scale belief that people are intentionally doing anything. It's just a means of like, what do we need to do to protect ourselves, and where do we draw lines? And that's very challenging. Like Rosebud next door to Pine Ridge didn't have roadblocks, and I think largely because they didn't have the resources to do it. It wasn't because they didn't want to. And I think that's a reality. I mean, whether or not the tribal council would have passed that or whatnot is hard to say. I don't want to speculate too much, but you have to pay a lot of people to be out on roadblocks morning, noon, and night. I mean, that's just a reality. So did that answer what you're looking for, Michael?
Very much so. Yes. Thank you for that detail.
Yeah.
And just kind of to piggyback on what you just said, it sounds like for folks like myself who, are halfway through my life expectancy, hitting this for the first time in the modern world, hearing more about the cause and effect of the past virus spreads in a layman's term seems to be very effective. At least it was for me through your explanation. So I thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's yeah, I mean, most of the world has it. You look back at pictures of Spanish flu, like everyone had masks on. This wasn't the first time, we talk about, I heard something probably on NPR, going back and forth to work, but, Shakespearean theater was shut down in England like 3 times over like a 30-year period or something to that effect, you know, because of different diseases being spread. And the idea of weaponization is interesting, because if you actually take feudal warfare serious, like germ warfare was used for, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years. We know we have significant evidence of it. You know, you go kill some chickens and throw it in someone's well. That was done, you know, catapulting dead cows into over castle walls and stuff like that. I mean, it's weird to think about, you know, I'm sure anyone who's seen Monty Python has already gone in their head to Monty Python catapulting a cow over a castle wall, but I mean, that was a reality, you know. So when it's interesting to think about the historical apologetic around American Indian genocide, around like, well, it was just a disease. It's like, well, no, you can't just say that. Like, if Columbus and Jamestown and the Pilgrims came and spread disease and then head back to the beach and be like, okay, our bad. You know, we see this is going on. This is probably associated with us, but we're gonna hold it back. Like, that didn't happen. You know, large numbers of indigenous people dying, particularly you can say in the Puritan New England, was a sign of God's providence. And I mean, those are kind of the blunt realities of the situation. So,
you have a question, right?
Well, actually, you started to get at my question, Mark. Yeah, you've got me thinking about European histories with plague, and the formation of what formation of that experience and that history was carried into the settler movement,
mm-hmm.
into the Americas. But so you've really, you know, they knew how to weaponize coming in. And
mm-hmm.
so no excuses.
Right.
But I'm wondering though about the knowledge of the impact of plagues on indigenous persons in other parts of the world too.
Mm-hmm.
And who understands that in a deeper way? Certainly, you know, we are experiencing something here, but I am thinking of that plague history now, and it's
mm-hmm.
always told from a white
yeah.
European lens.
Yeah. You know, that's a really good question. I don't have a lot of knowledge. Like, I'm in other areas, you know, so like I'm very interested in like Africa and Southern Africa. Like, I'd have to imagine there's some of that, right? I don't know if that anyone's written it, that I haven't seen particulars. And, you know, maybe because of trade up and down, you know, Nile and around the coast, maybe that there was a longer term engagement where it wasn't so impactful in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what was going on in India, you know, with British ships popping up every now and again. I don't have an answer on that, and I think that would be a very interesting way to think through this. I mean, particularly the way through a European lens, like the bubonic plague is just this catastrophic negotiation, and it was. I mean, you think a third of the people, right? That is like, it's hard to think through that. Like, and we know what came out of that. The economic shifts, right? I mean, the rise of mercantilism, you know, all of a sudden laborers have a voice because they can just go somewhere else and work and someone will pay them a little bit more. Like, that sort of like geopolitical ramifications that comes out of there is really, really useful to think about, I think. And that kind of helps throw the rest of Europe kind of in further chaos. I mean, what you get around 1330 and then 1500 you get the Reformation. Like, Europe is just in a reeling from one kind of chaotic, almost, you know, some sort of bomb going off repeatedly. And I always like to talk about that in the sense of like, it's really important to understand that the basis of colonization was not stability, right? It wasn't stable governments exporting out. It was just this grotesque infighting and just, I mean, it's basically backyard bully, schoolyard bully stuff at a geopolitical scale, mentally, right? I mean, just like, well, this is what I want. Well, I don't care what you want. I'm going to beat up on you and take it. And that's what was going on repeatedly. That is the basis of colonization. You know, it is not some sort of stable trajectory from Rome to Europe to America. You know, it's not this kind of negotiation. We have to be very honest about what are these devastating geopolitical events that just throw people out, you know, out of the water. And one that we run into a lot, particularly working with undergrads up here, is when we talk about boarding schools and, you know, good Christian folks working in the boarding schools, and the question that comes up semester after semester is like, that's a very foreign Christianity to me. I don't understand. And our students like, and it's an honest, I don't understand. How do you possibly get to that place to brutalize a child? And that's a really honest question, and I really appreciate that. And really, one of the better answers, in my opinion, is the actual relationship to life, particularly human life, that we understand as a post-World War II phenomenon. It's post-Jewish Holocaust, and this shifting, that I think there's a marked difference. We go back and we look, you know, Sand Creek out in Colorado, you know, everyone was in on the massacre, like they knew what was going on. And, you know, when they had the Senate commission come out there and question people on it, the people cheered, you know, kill them, kill them, kill them. Like, that is a gross reality. And that is some of the colonial history that we have to kind of own and think through. We can't presume that across time people have been nice and willing to work together. Like, this is a pretty new, I mean, you can even argue, I think, post-civil rights.
Yeah.
The types of relationships and the engagement around the value of people in this shift within larger Euro-American culture is a pretty new phenomenon, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, especially from students?
I have a question.
Stacy, yeah.
Yeah, so in my community, I've had this sense over a number of conversations about, I feel like the white dominant culture still feels like they own Native people, like their history is grounded in like Native Indigenous people who were here first. And so I've been involved in our school's mascot name change committee. One of my kids attends a school and they are the Indians. And the community is in an uproar, and we've been working for 4 or 5 years now on changing it, and we thought we had done it, and the backlash has been kind of unexpectedly overwhelming to me, as I'm thinking like we're perpetuating Indigenous people's identities for our own entertainment still 200, 300, 400, 500 years later. And I'm wondering, like, there isn't it's really hard to engage people who aren't willing to do research and who aren't willing to accept their own role in the perpetuation of discrimination, of dehumanization, marginalization that's happening. And do you have any suggestions for how to start approaching that at the local level?
You know, we can talk about ranges of things. There's no smoking gun and what that looks like. It really takes local leadership, and there's no kind of two ways around it. I think that I was just talking to my class last night around, you know, being almost 50. While I know people have been working with the Washington football team a long time, that's been a very, very hard one. And it really almost shocked me that people were willing to change it. Now, if we look at it, it really comes down to larger sponsorships. What sort of power structures can you put in play? If that's an option. So as much as I am a obvious proponent of education, devoting my career to it, education's not enough in these situations. It's just not. It is one of the factors, but it doesn't get people past that visceral, unspoken response, that emotional attachment. And that's the kind of piece that we don't know. Education isn't necessarily going to crack that. It'll crack it for some people. Generally speaking, most people, if you sit down with them talking, they're going to at least listen. Where's your town again?
Cocoa, Florida, Merritt Island, Florida. Okay.
Regionally, there are some differences. The colonial racism here in South Dakota is palpable. Like, it's recent, and it's like, it's different than it is in Michigan and New York, both other places I've spent. Denver is still at some level kind of the Wild West, and while there's a shift in kind of a duality because so many people moved in recently into the Denver area, there is still a palpable kind of grounded racism in institutions like the police and other places. That's just a reality. I think if you can find whatever sort of leadership, organizing 101 is, don't worry about hitting each individual. It's like if you get leadership to twist, if you find people who are leaders that are for it, and if they can switch, that would be kind of from an organizational perspective, as a community organizer, that would be, the best use of time. And I think narratives of people and how it actually hurts them. So I don't know if you've seen particularly for mascot stuff, More Than Words. So it was a documentary. So actually, a gentleman I know, John Little, he teaches at the University of South Dakota here at a neighboring institution. He put this out. There's another one that helps bring narratives involved. And the role of narrative and story is particularly important because, for example, we teach, mostly this is my wife, teaches South Dakota American Indian Culture and Education. And everyone going to be certified as a teacher has to take this course, certified through SDSU. And to have a teacher certification in South Dakota, someone has to take this or a course very like it at other institutions. And we found pretty early that a focus on academic study doesn't get us to those places with people, but novels do. And so there's a lot of Indigenous authors who write, effectively historical fiction, and are able to get that helps people to care in ways in which, facts, figures don't. You can make an academic argument, and for some people that'll work. Narrative works for a lot more people in my experience. If we stay in academia, have somebody reading Louise Erdrich isn't going to get us there. I'm going to have to come with it in footnotes and all sorts of fun stuff. But, in other areas, you have to make people understand and care. And the other thing, I guess I will kind of say, I could probably talk on this for hours, but remember that in the cultural psychology of Americana, Indigenous people don't exist in the present tense. It's not that's a very hard thing to think through, that we, because of the sort of teaching is Pilgrims, removal, a couple of treaties in the West, Manifest Destiny, and then nothing. The work of Edward Curtis, John Ford Hollywood films, this is the narrative, right? That we're in the way of manifest destiny, or either eradicated or somehow fought off by John Wayne single-handedly. And that is, you know, kind of the end of the narrative. That to actually exist in the present tense is very, very challenging. So I know that's not probably a smoking gun answer, and there's not a particular fast track of doing it. Some communities have just doubled down on this. You know, if you look at like Mount Pleasant, Michigan, with Central Michigan University still has the Chippewas, which is weird because I still don't know what a Chippewa is, even though I'm supposed to be one. Though it's a French term around Indigenous people, like it's not even our language, which makes this kind of weird. But the local Indigenous community there, Saginaw Chippewa tribe, was like, no, you have permission to use it. Even though 90% of Indigenous people are like wildly against any sort of mascot use, you know, and particularly institutionally for the NCAA, if a local community tribe says, no, we give you permission, then that's a backdoor into doing it. So they do it. And then other groups were like, well, they said it's okay. I know if you're down in Florida, the Seminole Nation did the same thing, you know, and while this is speculation on my point, going against something like Florida State would probably cut into the Hard Rock Casino budget. There's the fundamental bottom line reality to some of those things. So anyway, I wish you the best of luck. If you got other questions, I'm happy to look at it. But the documentary, and I would encourage, because it gets at some of those personal narratives of what this actually does to people in the present tense.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Freeland. And it has been over the time that I have asked you. Thank you so much, and very informative. But also, it's a reality that this reality has been going on for several hundred years, and we are not even scratching the real reality yet. And so we have so much work to do in solidarity, and I'm grateful that you are with us. So he will be the speaker for honors convocation, and also he will meet with students in some other time for mentoring purpose. But also he is has been teaching summer courses, so he will teach again next summer. And so please, pay attention to even summer courses, because he is officially a state university professor. He cannot teach for another institution during academic years when he is bounded with a contract. So that's why we are only inviting him to speak with us or teaching summer courses. And so also students, especially first year students, I host the Dinch Cafe pretty much monthly. It's mainly a social mingling time of students among yourselves, also staff and faculty. And we have a smaller group today, but we usually have, I look forward to those future days that we can visit with each other over at lunch. That's why it's called the Dinch Cafe. And also, sometimes I host only for students as a listening session, what are your needs? So I will also call upon on those occasions as sometime this early academic year. So spread the news, and Dean would like to listen to you and your concerns and your joys too. And also thank you and everyone else who joined here, and please stay healthy and well and safe. Thank you again, Dr. Freeland.
Thank you all, and I'll just put in a real quick plug. So on Tuesday, I'm giving a lecture here at South Dakota State. It's called the Henderson Achievement Lecture. I can send you all, it's going to be on Facebook Live. So for folks who wanted to witness that as well. And I'll be going into kind of making a discussion of American Indian Studies and culture as in commonality with liberal arts tradition, and kind of what I call as an indigenous intervention around academia and the role of Indigenous people in academia. So I can send that out if folks would be interested.
Yes.
That's another opportunity to kind of engage in material if folks are interested.
So we will make today's video available through our social media and our webpage. And also, Mark, if you send those links either to me or Betsy, we can send it to the community.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I always really enjoy these talks and the engagement. I look forward to actually meeting in person again at some point, but thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.